My name is Rihanna Calvert, and the last thing I expected was to hear my father laugh at me in front of hundreds of people loud, cruel, as if I were the family embarrassment he needed to parade around. But that wasn't the part that gutted me. It was the moment right after when the drill sergeant leading my brother's graduation ceremony froze mid-step, stared straight at me, and whispered words that made my father's face drain of color. My God, you're... Everything I'd spent years hiding detonated in that single breath, and that's where my story begins. The drive from Denver to Rapid City stretched out like a single, unbroken exhale, the kind you don't realize you've been holding until your chest starts to ache. The dashboard kept blinking wind advisories, warning me about the gusts rolling down from the Black Hills. On the radio, a local station replayed a segment about an old wildfire in Montana. I listened without reacting. I'd been there once, in a way no broadcaster would ever know. But the world had moved on without my name attached to anything. I kept the volume low. I always did when I got close to South Dakota. Silence made the miles heavier, but cleaner. I wasn't going back for anyone except my brother. His commissioning ceremony at Wyoming Joint Base meant everything to him, and whether my family liked it or not, showing up still mattered. My father never said it outright, but every comment he made carried the same weight. I was the one who never stayed put long enough to satisfy him. Every time he talked about stability, it felt like he was driving a tack deeper, marking me as someone who hadn't lived up to whatever version of daughter he thought he deserved. That was why I didn't go home. I hadn't in almost a decade. Isai. Instead, I checked into a roadside motel off the highway, thin carpet, rattling AC unit, and the same hollow smell all cheap rooms share. I didn't bother to unpack. I lay down on the bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling as the air kicked on and off in uneven spurts. Tomorrow, I'd stand somewhere in the crowd, close enough for my brother to see me if he looked hard enough, far enough that no one else would. Outside, the wind scraped against the metal railings, a steady reminder that I was back on familiar ground. I glanced at the time glowing beside the bed, let my eyes fall shut, and hoped without much expectation that sleep would come without dragging old memories behind it. Morning at Wyoming Joint Base always carried strong winds, but that day the air moved differently, heavier, tighter, like the breath before a storm finally breaks open. The moment my badge scanned at the gate, I felt something shift. The flow of movement inside the base didn't match the energy of a graduation morning. Whole corridors that should have been busy were sparse, leaving only a few officers gathered in tight huddles, tapping fast across their tablets as if they were racing against a clock no one else could see. Overhead, the digital boards kept flickering, freezing for a split second on command prompts before snapping back to the main display. The glitches weren't severe, just wrong enough to make the back of my neck tighten. Near the far side of the courtyard, a cluster of soldiers in training gear stood apart from everyone else. No name tapes, no unit patches, no identifiers at all. They weren't celebrating, chatting, or even pretending to relax. They were watching people, watching movement, watching patterns. Then a Humvee barreled out from the direction of the operations center, tires grinding hard against the pavement. Graduation mornings usually had a hum of excitement, but never urgency. This was urgency written in exhaust and steel. Each detail alone could have been dismissed, but together they formed a picture I recognized too well. When the surface looked calm, but the rhythm underneath faltered, something was brewing, something that hadn't made itself known yet. As I walked toward the seating area, a thin crackle rolled through a narrow radio frequency between the main operational bands. It was faint, almost like static, but trained ears didn't miss things like that. It wasn't part of the base's public channels. It was a thread buried in the system, the kind of thing most people would never pick up unless they had spent years listening for disturbances exactly like it. Then came the second twist. A young officer stationed near the platform looked directly at me, not a passing glance. A recognition check. He stiffened immediately when I noticed him, turning away a beat too fast, trying to pretend he hadn't been studying my face a moment earlier. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at me like they'd been warned ahead of time, but it still made my pulse sink low into my stomach. I kept walking, kept my expression neutral, found a seat along the middle rows. Families were gathering in excited clusters, waving programs and snapping photos. The sky was bright, the field buzzing with anticipation. But underneath it all, I could feel the bass holding its breath. Something was pressing in from the edges, quiet but determined, as if waiting for the right moment to surface. So, whatever it was close. They arrived late, true to form. My father moved ahead of the rest, chin tilted up, shoulders thrown back in that familiar blend of confidence and carelessness. He spared me a single look before turning toward a couple standing nearby and launching into a comment sharp enough to cut through the morning air. His words landed exactly where he wanted them to, not at me through me. My mother hovered beside him, her fingers tightening around her purse strap. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The quick flutter of her eyelashes said more than she wanted anyone to notice. Jack followed behind them, trying to smile like everything was normal. It wasn't. Not between us. Not after all the years we'd lived on opposite sides of a wall none of us ever named out loud. I slipped into a row several seats away. Distance was easier than pretending. A cold stream of wind swept across the parade field, carrying the mountain air with it. I was adjusting my jacket when a faint vibration pulsed inside the lining. I angled my body so only I could see the tiny, encrypted device. Unusual movement detected near your position. Stand by. A short message, but heavy enough to settle right into my spine. Signals like that weren't sent accidentally. Someone important had stepped into the vicinity, or something had been triggered nearby. This was my brother's day. It wasn't supposed to touch anything else. But the signs weren't just adding up, they were aligning with frightening precision. Families settled into place. The bass band struck its opening note. I leaned back in my seat, drawing in a steady breath, trying to quiet the instinct rising beneath my ribs. Within half a minute, everything I understood about this morning and my place in it would fracture clean in two. The band's opening notes were still rolling across the parade field when the sun flared off the polished uniforms, turning the formation into a wall of blinding white and steel. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself to focus on Jack, not the pressure building behind my ribs. But just as the crowd finally settled, my father rose to his feet in the worst possible moment, drawing every nearby eye to him. He didn't bother lowering his voice. He never had. His words cut through the quiet rows with the ease of someone used to being heard, and the faces in front of him turned with a mix of confusion and discomfort. When my gaze met Jack's, he immediately looked down, shoulders folding inward. We'd lived with this kind of humiliation long enough to know the routine. But none of that prepared me for what happened next. Drill Sergeant Reed, who was supposed to be guiding the formation straight toward the reviewing stand, suddenly halted. Not a misstep, not a correction, a full-body stop. So abrupt, the soldiers behind him froze in perfect sync. It was like someone pulled the plug out of him. The cadence collapsed. Even the wind seemed to falter as his eyes swept the bleachers row by row until they locked on me. The look he gave wasn't surprise. It was recognition. And recognition from the wrong person meant trouble. Then he broke from the formation and headed straight for where I sat. The murmurs surged from all directions, people twisting in their seats, trying to understand why the ceremony had cracked open before it even began. I clenched my hands to keep them from shaking. One misstep from him or from me could ignite a chain reaction this base wasn't ready for. He stopped in front of me, leaned in just enough to speak privately, and waited for my response. "Mosto," I answered quietly, following protocol to keep the situation contained. It didn't matter. The fallout hit instantly. Officers all along the field touched their earpieces in unison. Personnel from the operations center moved with forced calm toward the control building. My father's face drained. My mother covered her mouth, and Jack stared at me like he'd just realized he'd never really known the person standing in front of him. Then the security lights across the base shifted in a coordinated sweep. Amber Protocol. A warning disguised as silence. Wyoming Joint Base had just redrawn its priorities, and I was now part of its center. Amber Protocol didn't blare alarms. It pressed the air into stillness. The lighting changed. The rules changed. And suddenly, every step anyone took mattered. I stood because remaining seated felt like pretending nothing had shifted. but nothing was normal anymore. And the base was reacting to me before I could even react to it. My father grabbed my wrist with a force that wasn't anger, at least. Not only anger, fear edged his voice as he demanded answers he had no right to ask, for the first time. I saw him lose footing in his certainty. The ground beneath him tilted, and he didn't know how to stand on it. Before I could answer, my encrypted device buzzed once sharp and unmistakable. The message was brief but devastating. An internal breach attempt. Someone on base had triggered access to federal data tied directly to me. Today of all days. Right here. In the middle of Jack's moment. Then Marquez appeared beside me, urgency sharp in his posture. He requested I follow him to the control center, and my father tried to intervene, but Marquez didn't spare him a glance. Authority outranked lineage here. Inside the operations room, screens flickered with information. Marquez pulled up the access log, a file from Idaho, dormant code, a civilian device, and the source location lighting up exactly where my family had been sitting. 3 flagged devices, 3 people who never should have been anywhere near that file. My father, Jack, Kelly. The base didn't arrest them, but it confined their movement. They were boxed in by protocol, watched closely. No matter how innocent their faces looked, Marquez asked for my identification. I handed him the thin, plain card. When the scanner lit up and shifted into its classified interface, the room shifted with it. Reed's expression hardened into something between respect and realization, and in the silence that followed, every person in that room understood one thing. Whatever this was, it went far deeper than they ever expected. The control room pulsed with yellow light, each blink tightening the air like a vice. Wyoming Joint Base moved with the jittery precision of a body hit with pure adrenaline, every person bracing for impact before knowing what the impact would be. I stood in the middle of that frantic energy, not fully belonging to either side, too close to the military to be dismissed. Too much of an outsider for them to know how to treat me, and far too complicated for my family to look at without fear. Jack was the first one pulled away. 2 officers guided him toward an interview room, and the panic in his eyes wasn't the kind that comes from guilt. It was the kind that comes from thinking someone you love might mistake you for a threat. When my father shouted across the room, pointing to me as if offering a sacrifice, the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. Marquez cut through the moment with an icy warning, explaining the flagged devices and the need to question every civilian involved. My father's voice collapsed into silence, swallowed by a fear he didn't yet understand. Then my device vibrated once sharp, unmistakable. Node ping. A trace tied back to Idaho. 7 years of buried tension rose in my throat like smoke. Morrow hadn't resurfaced in all that time, but the signature on the breach was his. Not aimed at the base. Aimed at me. The fear spiraled when Kelly admitted, shaking, that she'd tapped a file labeled Arrival Notice, thinking it was a family message. She had no idea she'd activated a dormant trap. Her innocence nearly pushed the base toward lockdown, but the second flagged attempt, the one matching my father's old Android, split the air even further. He stammered that he'd only taken photos. I believed him. He had no concept of unauthorized access. He didn't understand how quickly this machine could consume him. Jack's interrogation piled onto the chaos. When asked about sending a link to Kelly, he swore he hadn't. For the first time in years, I believed every word. Then came the turning point. Marquez said they needed me to trace the source. If I stepped in, my family stayed protected for now. Reed held my gaze long enough to make the stakes clear before he nodded. And just like that, I became the barrier between my family and the system tightening around them. The secure interface opened with a hiss. Screens roaring to life as classified protocols unlocked. Reed, Marquez, and 2 technicians flanked me as I sat before the cascading code. Every line felt like a ghost from a past I hadn't intended to meet again. Then the breach signature hit. Target identified, Calvert. Event chain reactivated. The code wasn't meant for the base. It was meant for me. Reed's quiet realization cut through the hum. He remembered Montana, the evacuation, the chaos, and now understood the face he'd seen only in fragments back then. But another anomaly surfaced. A secondary signature that didn't belong to Morrow. It belonged to someone inside the base. Wade, Jack's instructor, my father's favorite example of discipline. The man standing close enough this morning to brush Kelly's phone, Kelly's memory, Jack's confession, and the access logs aligned in one chilling shape. Wade wasn't the mastermind, he was the doorway, and he had opened it for someone who wanted me back in his sights. The door of the control room sealed behind me with a metallic thud, the kind that settled straight into the spine. Wyoming Joint Base felt colder than it had minutes before. Every sound sharper, every shadow longer. I headed toward the northern training sector, knowing the margin for error had vanished. Wade wasn't just a loose thread, he was the opening Morrow had been waiting for. Jack spotted me and rushed over, fear tightening his voice. I told him to stay behind me. He did, though his breath shook like he expected me to disappear again. Wade stood outside the equipment bay, clipboard in hand, expression unsettlingly calm. When he lifted his eyes to mine, he gave a thin smile, almost practiced. His first words hit wrong the rhythm, the tone, too close to something I'd heard years ago through a breach that should never have followed me here. The echo of Morrow sat in the back of his voice. He admitted everything with an eerie casualness. He'd only opened a window, he said. He'd only helped someone smarter see inside. He told me I didn't need to be here, that stepping away would solve more than confronting him ever could. Then he raised his phone. The same icon Kelly had tapped blinked on his screen. I lunged, but the file activated before I made contact. A deep ping reverberated across the base. Red lights erupted overhead. Loudspeakers rolled out a new alert. Primary target, Calvert. R. In an instant, the entire base reoriented, every protocol turning toward me as the threat now locked in its sights. Red protocol locked the base down so quickly it felt like the walls tightened around us. Reed walked beside me without a word, leading me into a bright, sterile conference room that looked more like a tribunal than a briefing. Everyone was already seated, Jack and Kelly huddled close, my parents rigid in their chairs, Marquez standing at attention, 2 ICRN coordinators poised behind laptops, and a regional command officer watching the door as if expecting it to explode. The only empty seat sat in the center of the U-shaped table. Mine. The message was clear. When Reed began the presentation, the room dimmed and the screen came alive with the decrypted structure of the breach. He explained how the arrival notice file had never been a message, but bait and old tripwire coded to lie dormant for 7 years, waiting for a civilian device to wake it. He detailed how the signature embedded in the activation string matched the remnants of Morrow's last attack, and how the targeting line naming me had survived intact. The words hung in the air with a chill that even the lights couldn't warm. My mother raised a trembling hand to her mouth. My father's expression cracked wide open, not angry, but stunned, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. Jack's breath escaped in a long, shaky release. "Eski." Then Marquez asked for what no data file could provide context. I told them I had been the coordinator who cut off Morrow's escape in Idaho, the one he'd sworn to outrun if he ever resurfaced. I didn't mention Montana or anything else. The truth already changed the temperature of the room. Conversations died mid-breath. The next revelation cleared Kelly entirely. The logs showed she'd only opened the file, never sent or triggered anything intentionally. She broke down, and Jack pulled her into his arms, relief softening his entire posture. Then my father rose, slowly, carefully. His voice shook as he admitted he had failed to protect me, that whatever blame he'd thrown over the years had come from ignorance, not truth. Reed placed a steady hand on his shoulder and told him the reality: no one could have shielded me from what happened in 2016. But today, because of what I had done, the base had been protected from something far worse. No one spoke after that. They didn't need to. When the hearing ended and Red Protocol lifted, the base loosened its grip on the air. It felt like everyone had survived something they didn't fully understand. I stepped outside, letting the late Wyoming sun fall over the dust-red concrete. The wind sharp enough to wake every nerve in my body. Jack reached me first. His apology came out in broken pieces, heavy with guilt he'd carried too long. I wrapped my arms around him, steady and quiet. I told him the truth had simply taken longer to surface, and none of that was on him. My father stood a few paces back, shoulders dropped, fighting for words that never came. He didn't have to say them. The look in his eyes told me he finally saw the distance he'd created. I didn't blame him, but I also knew I couldn't fold myself back into who I'd been before today. A black ICRN SUV pulled up. A new mission file waited on the seat, another path, another responsibility. Before climbing in, I glanced at the parade grounds one last time and murmured to myself, I'm not running. I'm moving forward. The door shut, and the dust rose behind us as the base disappeared in the mirror.